I'm Jack DeJoy. I'm the president here at Georgetown University, and it's my distinct privilege to welcome you to the first session of the Symposium on the State of West-Islamic Dialogue. As we begin this discussion, I would like to take this opportunity to underscore the purpose of today's meeting and how essential this is as we move forward. This moment in time demands our engagement. Our global community today offers us such great promise. A more dynamic and interconnected world means greater opportunities for humanity. But as the world has become smaller, it has also become more divided, more polarized, more fraught with the potential for discord. In considering the state of relations between the West and the Islamic world, the gap in understanding is such that it affects world security and stability. We face media coverage that is too often marked not by a pursuit of understanding, but on a search for disharmony. And we see a great and widening knowledge gap between important forces that could today make a difference for good in our world. And it's an imperative for us that we engage in a productive and thoughtful dialogue to try to close this gap, this knowledge gap. In April of 2007, UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon appointed former Portuguese President Jorge Sampaio as the first UN High Representative for the Alliance of Civilizations. It's a global campaign dedicated to bridging the divide between Islam and the West. In May, former British Prime Minister Tony Blair announced the establishment of the Blair Foundation dedicated to fostering interfaith dialogue. And in June, President Bush stated that he would appoint a U.S. envoy to the Organization of the Islamic Conference in order to listen and learn. All of these announcements were recognition that one of humanity's most pressing concerns is developing a deeper understanding of the world's religions and their role in global affairs. And Georgetown is honored to be able to convene such a dialogue today. As we examine what more must be done in the pursuit of greater understanding, particularly among different faiths, in order to foster a more peaceful and just global community, we at Georgetown are deeply proud to share in this goal with all of you. We're also truly honored that two of our research centers have made this symposium possible, the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, and the Prince Alwaleed bin Talal Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding. We're privileged to host today's discussion, and we're honored to bring together such distinguished leaders for such an important goal. So I want to thank you all for taking the time to be with us today. I look forward to hearing from our panel this morning and to the opportunity to discuss these issues with you over the course of the day today. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Jack. We're delighted that all of you could make it, and we have people here from various parts of the world representing different constituencies. One of the remarkable things about the meeting thus far is that it started on time, the first session ended on time, and this session is started on time. And because we have received marching orders twice, that is, my colleagues on the panel, that their presentations are to be 10 minutes each, I know that they will have to engage in enormous restraint in order for them to finish their presentations on time, so we can have enough time for discussion and end this panel on time. So I've now emphasized on time enough. Also, following up on the President's comments, just by coincidence, this morning I had breakfast with Jorge Sampaio, and he had hoped to come. He sent his best wishes. And the Alliance, in fact, will be following up, as I mentioned to Sharif, with the WEF on ways in which, where we overlap, there can be cooperation. Our panel this morning on West-Islamic Dialogue, Religion and Values, we have a number of distinguished presenters, and I'm going to be very brief because the biographies are available. Our first speaker today is Professor Lamin Sanneh, D. Willis James Professor of Missions and World Christianity at Yale University.
Thank you very much. My remarks will really be sort of notes towards an agenda. One of the first things I think one has to recognize is that when we speak of dialogue, we're speaking of a relationship. In our universities in the West, we are extraordinarily good at training scholars with in-depth knowledge of the history, language, geography, and economics of the Middle East and of the Muslim world. And the department structure of the modern university has also been tremendously productive in the production of knowledge and the transmission of knowledge. What we're not so very good at is interdisciplinary work and conversation. In many of the universities I'm familiar with, namely Harvard and Yale, we try to produce a core curriculum because we discovered that at the end of the undergraduate years of training, 4 years in this case, when undergraduates come to collect their diploma, that is to say, when they come to the checkout, it doesn't add up. 4 years of the undergraduate curriculum has not succeeded in producing an integrated body of knowledge. And the core curriculum is a way to address that very serious shortcoming in undergraduate education. My daughter went to Columbia and read classics, ancient Roman history, and discovered that in her class were students who were majoring in chemistry, astronomy, biology, physics, and so forth and so on, sociology. But all of them were studying the so-called grade books. So that at the end of 4 years of undergraduate education, students have a body of knowledge in common so that they can talk to one another. And I think the failure, our shortcoming as university teachers, in encouraging students to talk across the disciplines to each other, comes out in the failure to understand dialogue properly. Dialogue is conversation, dialogue is relationship. And the other thing to say specifically about the Islam-West dialogue is to recall the words of Ogden Nash. One would not be in peril of the wiles of a stranger if one's own kith and kin were more fun to be with. We fight because we have something in common. We never fight a perfect stranger, somebody we never know, never come into contact with. And dialogue really is an attempt to deal with our differences and to celebrate what really does separate us, to affirm that and to celebrate it. And it seems to me that the West-Islam dialogue falls exactly into that pattern. We have so much in common that caricatures are very easy between us and among us. The third thing I'd like to say is a kind of historical note. I went to Istanbul for the first time a few months ago and stood in the middle of the Hagia Sophia, and I gazed in the dome. And those of us who've been there, those of you who've been there, will recognize that stuck in the ceiling are the 4 rightly guided caliphs, the names of the 4 rightly guided caliphs, the Orthodox Caliphate. And of course, the mihrab, the direction of prayer, the orientation of the cathedral was switched so that the orientation was towards Mecca. And then in the course of our days, we went through the Bosporus many times, and we were given lectures about the various currents flowing through the Bosporus. What struck me then, 1453, the fall of Constantinople, was I started to reflect on the work of the great Catholic theologians and philosophers. 2 of them, Nicholas of Cusa, and the other one, John of Segovia, did reflect on the balance sheet between the West and the Muslim world, and decided that the era of the Crusades could no longer be returned to. We couldn't really reactivate the Crusades, much as Pius II wanted to do that. Of course, you know what happened to Pius II, the last so-called Crusader, 1464. But John of Segovia and Nicholas of Cusa, both of them stressed the importance of conference, of dialogue. 1453, in a sense, marked, for me, the end of this tremendous intellectual conversation between the Muslim world and the West. And there was a rupture. A curtain came down. Our students today, who are very well trained, know very little about the Muslim world and the intellectual tradition of Islam. Many, many Muslims educated in the West are very familiar with the Western intellectual tradition. And it seems to me that one of the challenges we face in our universities, which is where I've spent most of my life, is how to open up the system. I feel, I don't want to embarrass him, that Seyyed Hossein Nasr's very important work, University of Chicago Lectures, such a long time ago, The Encounter of Man and Nature, should really become a text for the environmental movement, and to bring together the integration of knowledge to bear on the pressures and the challenges of the environment. And so my 10 minutes are nearly up. I think it's important in dialogue to look not only at a restatement of who we are and what we are, but an articulation of those issues across the frontiers in terms of explaining ourselves to the other side, which in many ways is also our side. And so dialogue, I hope, will be fence building, making neighbors, making relationships in spite of our differences. And those differences are real. It would be naive to pretend that we don't have differences. But the idea of dialogue is to sort of confront those differences, to celebrate them, to affirm them, and to engage with one another, because we need one another, we depend on one another. Thank you.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you very much. Our second speaker is Dr. Mustafa Ceric, Reisu-l-uleme, President of the Ulama, Grand Mufti of the Islamic Community of Bosnia, Hercegovina.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor John Esposito, for introducing me. And if you allow me, I will spend of my precious time 1 minute or so just to tell you how proud I am and how pleased I am that you invited me for this symposium. And also I must tell you that I am a little bit envious of you, because your books are read among the Muslims, by Muslims, more than mine. Because you made so much to serve the Islamic culture and explaining Islam and Muslims in the West, but not only in the West, but also in the East among the Muslims, that I use this opportunity to thank you very much and to say that you are a very good example how dialogue between the West, if you accept the West all successes and failures, because failures have no fathers. The only success have fathers. Failures are orphans. No one wants to associate. But I think that your example telling me and is encouraging me to explain to the West what is Islam and to Muslims what is the West. But unfortunately, none is listening when we want them to listen. But we have to work. For this occasion, I would like to bring you some of my ideas. Probably some of them are, as I said in a closed session, probably some of them are crazy ideas. But since I am at the Georgetown University and I am a product of Chicago University, I hope you don't mind to lecture you here at Georgetown University from Chicago, because Chicago is my kind of city still. I see the West-Islamic dialogue within 3 or 4 or 5 frameworks that are very important, which probably I will continue to work on, but on this occasion I will just mention and probably give you idea to think about it. The first area or framework is the West-Islamic historical dialogue. The first interaction was in Baghdad, where the Muslims had taken the lead in the 8th century by translating Greek philosophy in the House of Wisdom. So the Muslims have the credit for the historical dialogue between what we can call today the West and Islam. I am not comfortable with that, but take it as it is. The second interaction was in Cordoba, Spain, where the Muslims continued to play the role of promoting Greek rational philosophy through the work of Ibn Rushd Averroes in 12th century, the result of which was the movement of European humanism in Renaissance. I don't know why Muslims don't emphasize this, that they are part of this Western civilization as well. And we Muslims are responsible what is happening now in the West, whether we like it or not, because we introduced to Europe, or Muslims, my grandfather Ibn Rushd, together with the Jewish scholarship, to Europe to rationalism. So Muslims have taught Europe to be rational. We can discuss about later if you don't agree with me, but this is how I believe. And the third interaction was in Europe, where the Europeans had begun in 18th century to learn about the faith and culture of Islam. And we are now at the threshold, I think, of a new interaction where this dispute about moral issues. I think the West does not understand the Muslim sensitivity of some of the moral issues in the West. And the West has, I think, somehow is, from the Muslim perspective, too arrogant about certain issues of the moral importance. This is how things are look like. The second framework is the West-Islamic theological dialogue, and I will not spend time here because this dialogue is continuous, is in the process. You cannot put it in a time frame, or it's going on all the time, because we read the books and we have our opinion about Jesus, about Maryam, about Prophet Muhammad, about Moses, and so on and so on. But I would just point out that in the Middle Ages, the Jews, Christians, and Muslims were together or unified in the so-called cosmological argument for the existence of God. But David Hume and others came and they actually made this argument not irrelevant anymore in a theological framework. But anyway, the third framework is the Islamic cultural dialogue. The West-Islamic cultural dialogue has been the most productive dialogue during the last 2 or 3 centuries. The initiative for this dialogue came from the West, whereby major Western universities opened the departments for Oriental studies, that is the study of Arabic language and Islamic culture in the broadest sense of the word. It is due to these Oriental studies in the West that we have today valuable references on Islamic culture which are relevant not only for the West but also for Islam. The works such as the Islamic Encyclopedia, the Index of Hadith, and the edition and translation of the fundamental Islamic theological and philosophical works which are available to the academic community in the West are the undisputable proof of the Western contribution to the development of the West-Islamic cultural dialogue. This is, I hope that the West will be proud of that. The fourth framework of the West-Islamic dialogue is the West-Islamic political dialogue. And that is, however, the West-Islamic political dialogue remains the greatest of all challenges in the West-Islamic dialogue today. We are here talking about politics. We are not talking about religions, cultures, or no clashes of civilizations. We have here clashes of political perception. What is the political interest of the West, and what is the political interest in the Muslim world? And the Muslim world is divided not according to their theological issues, but according to their political interest regarding affiliation to that or this or that world. And therefore, We may start with Israel-Palestinian conflict, or we may end with it, but we cannot escape it wherever we go and whatever we do. And finally, the fifth framework of West-Islamic dialogue, I think, and that is a little bit hard, but I will say it anyway, so you can take it or you will leave it here. The West-Islamic political dialogue, or the lack of it, leads us inevitably to the West-Islamic military dialogue. This is, I believe, the key of all the West-Islamic dialogue today, the political military dialogue which should lead to the West-Islamic Treaty Organization. Yes, you are right. This is my personal opinion. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, is outdated. We need a new and fresh WITO, West-Islamic Treaty Organization, for the 21st century. Similarities are so obvious that it is enough to say that the West cannot make and maintain the global peace and security in the world, especially in the Middle East, without an active Muslim participation in that. The sooner we realize that, the better for all. So you can win the war, but you cannot win the peace. So I am for the heroes who know how to make the peace and not the heroes who know how to make the war. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Dean Jane McAuliffe, who is the Dean of Georgetown College, Georgetown University, and is a prominent scholar of Islam and of Quranic studies, among other things.
Thank you. Thank you, and good morning. Recently, I've been thinking about Abraham, the father figure claimed by our three Western monotheisms. I've been puzzling about his popularity, the ubiquity of references to Abraham in so many interreligious initiatives. The number of Abraham-named groups, outreach efforts, study sessions, and symposia is now uncountable. I still recall the surprise of seeing the patriarch's picture on the cover of Time magazine in 2002. The lead article was prompted by a new book entitled Abraham that was to spend many weeks on the bestseller list and to enjoy prominent exposure on TV and radio talk shows. While much of this media attention postdates 9/11, many Abraham initiatives predate it. I recall that in the late 1990s, I was invited by the Chautauqua Institution to give a series of lectures on Muhammad and the Quran as part of their newly formed Abrahamic program, a program that has now expanded into a network of interfaith efforts that extends well beyond that summer camp for the mind on the shores of Lake Erie. This proliferation of Abraham events shows no signs of abating. This summer, I was visited by the director of a new initiative at California's famous Esalen Center, a peace and reconciliation program that is being called an Abrahamic family reunion. Just days later, I found myself in conversation with Father Paolo Dall'Olio, the Italian Jesuit who heads a Christian monastery in Syria. And I heard him talk about his involvement with the Abraham Path Initiative. Plans are underway to create a walking trail from Haran to Hebron that will encompass many of the sites associated with Abraham in both the biblical and the Quranic narratives. Although this is being promoted chiefly as an economic enterprise in sustainable tourism, the Abraham Path is expected to function, at least according to its website, as, and I quote, a neutral platform for human encounter and cross-cultural understanding. Georgetown University has certainly not ignored this avalanche of interest in Abraham-associated events. Last spring, the university inaugurated a week-long program entitled The Children of Abraham, a festival of interfaith arts. This festival, which we hope will become an annual event, represents an effort to move intercultural and interfaith activities beyond the realm of discourse to draw upon the rich vocabularies of the visual and performing arts. It featured music and dance performances drawn from the Jewish, Christian, and Muslim cultures, but also included a group of Tibetan Buddhist monks who spent a week in the intricate assembly of a sand mandala and its ritual destruction. Clearly, we were operating beyond the usual connotations of children of Abraham or Abrahamic faiths. Why are we so enamored of Abraham? Why does he figure so prominently in dialogue events at the local, regional, national, and even international levels? Perhaps his primary appeal, certainly the one that would foster a very inclusive attitude to interfaith work, as witnessed the Buddhist monks at Georgetown's Children of Abraham Festival, perhaps his primary appeal is foreshadowed in the biblical and Quranic texts that strike a note of universality. In Genesis 12, God tells Abraham, "I will make you a great nation." And in Genesis 17, he repeats, "I have made you the father of a multitude of nations," a promise that the Apostle Paul echoes in Romans 4. In the second surah of the Quran, after God had tested Abraham and Abraham met that test, God vows, "Truly, I make you an imam for humankind." Another reason why we may find Abraham so appealing is that his story embodies qualities that our monotheistic traditions honor, qualities that I would pair as faith and fidelity, family and fruitfulness. For Christianity and Islam, faith in God and fidelity to that faith is a fundamental virtue. In both the Bible and the Quran, Abraham's story proves that faith in God is not an easy virtue, but one that is tested and retested through trials both human and divine. Abraham, the almost superhuman paragon of faith, is balanced, however, by Abraham as the very human parent and patriarch. Here again, our religious traditions find common ground in celebrating his fatherhood and the fruitfulness with which God blessed him. A focus on the family has long been an aspect of that form of interfaith action known as the dialogue of works. In unison, our traditions have supported efforts and initiatives, both national and international, that foster strong families and enduring ties across the generations. But Abraham is also a contentious figure. Each of the religious traditions that trace their lineage from Abraham has sought to seize him for itself, to make exclusivist claims. Quite early, Christians began to argue that Jesus Christ is the true heir of Abraham, and that the command to sacrifice Isaac was a prototype of the crucifixion. Muslims have followed the Quranic assertion in Surah 3, and I quote, "Abraham was not a Jew, nor yet a Christian, but he was an upright man, Hanif, who had surrendered to God, and he was not of the idolaters." In other words, Abraham can function as a point of conflict, not connection. Perhaps it is precisely these complexities, these tensions, these disjunctions in the Abraham figure that fit him so well for the task of personifying contemporary interreligious and intercultural dialogue. It will surprise no one to hear that all participants in any form of dialogue bring multiple identities to the table. Our genes and genders, our personal histories, our religious and social formations, our positions and professions, all of these factors shape our participation. One aspect of this is the hybridity manifest by those of us who are scholars of one tradition and adherents of another. If I may speak personally for a moment, all of my professional life has been focused on the study and teaching of a religion to which I do not belong. I was initially drawn to the study of Islam by simple intellectual curiosity, a fascination with the unknown. There was very little in the educational background of Americans of my generation that would have exposed them to Islam, particularly to its profound religious insights. In the years, well, decades really, that I have devoted myself to research on Islam, I find that I have become ever more deeply impressed by the practices of Muslim piety and ever more deeply affected by Muslim understandings of the divine. One is not untouched by the encounter with another religion. I bring this hybridity to the forms and forums of interreligious dialogue in which I participate, and quite a number of my academic colleagues do likewise. For many of us, the complexities of our individual identities as participants in dialogue are matched by the complexities of our classrooms. Those of my generation who study and teach religions other than Christianity have experienced an extraordinary change in the context and conceptualization of our academic work. We who were educated in North American and European universities assumed that we would spend our careers teaching these other religions to people much like ourselves. Little did we realize that the force of demographic diversification would soon overtake us. Within the space of a few decades, university classrooms changed from homogeneous to heterogeneous. Over the years that I was at the University of Toronto, Muslim students moved from being a small minority to becoming the classroom majority. And given the religious and cultural diversity among these students, discussions often became intra-religious dialogues. The multi-religious classroom, a reality that Georgetown is now living on both its Washington and Doha campuses, operates as a laboratory for intercultural education from the ground up. To recognize the multiple identities that each person brings to interreligious or intercultural dialogue, to realize the increasingly pluralistic context of our cities and our classrooms, is to live with the complexities and the tensions so vividly embodied in the persona of Abraham. Far from being simply a symbol of sweetness and light, of what one might call kumbaya around the campfire, Abraham exemplifies both the concord and the discord that interreligious and intercultural dialogue can create. More importantly, perhaps a man who could uproot himself and his family, who could challenge the religion of his ancestors, who could haggle with God himself, who could contend with competing wives and concubines, and who could risk the destruction of his beloved son, models the sheer human courage that genuine dialogue demands. Thank you.
Very good.
Thank you very much, Jane. And our final speaker for this session is Professor Seyyed Hossein Nasr, University Professor of Islamic Studies at George Washington University.
Professor Esposito, dear friends, this session is supposed to deal with religion and values within the context of Islam and dialogue, and my few comments will address themselves precisely to this issue. First of all, I think we should remember that everything we do, whether it's political, economic, social, personal, public, or private, are based on our worldview, on what we think of ourselves, the image we have of ourselves, and the meaning of the world. And that lies at the heart of religion. Worldview lies at the heart of religion or irreligion, that is a rejection of religion. The word worldview itself began to be used about 50 years ago by American scholars, trying not to use the German word Weltanschauung, which is still used once in a while. But there's also another word in German, is Gottsanschauung, the God view instead of worldview, which unfortunately did not get translated into English very much. And the dialogue between Islam and Christianity and the West, the three of them, I'll get to that in a moment, involves both, of course, worldview and God view in the sense of the German word. That is what we think is the reality, ultimate reality, and we think is the reality in the world, of the world in which we live. And as I said, everything we do relies upon that. And so at the heart of all dialogue resides the understanding of the other's worldview in all of its dimensions, going finally to God view or the rejection thereof by atheists and secularists. We must distinguish at the present juncture, as has already been pointed out by others, between not only Islam in the West and Islam and Christianity, which is a very, very important distinction. The two are not identical. The Islamic Western dialogue and Islamic Christian dialogue are not identical. But also we must consider the influence of non-Christian elements, secularist elements within Christianity itself, since the end of the Middle Ages, and now to some extent within the Islamic world. This is a very great importance. I've participated in so many religious dialogues. Oftentimes on the Christian side, the element of faith, of ethics, of being faithful to one's fidelity, as Professor McAuliffe just said, are common. But one side has been conditioned to accept a mechanistic, materialistic worldview of modern science and technology, and doesn't bother to see the contradictions that exist between what the Bible teaches or Christian worldview teaches and that worldview out there. And a great deal of tension that exists in the West today is of course related to this issue, whether it's the question of abortion or euthanasia or anything else like that. Now, to understand the significance of worldviews in any kind of religious dialogue, let me just point out to a few issues. The purpose of life. What are we doing here in this world? Obviously, that determines everything. That's what makes us run from morning to night. Can we discuss the other without understanding his or her understanding of the purpose of life? The question, which now is relegated only to theological debates, but has a very important political implication, immortality. Modern secularism and modern scientism, not science itself, have taken away from many people the hope for immortality, or as this have made it very ambiguous. And that's why it's so difficult for many people in the West to understand why young people kill themselves. They're called terrorists, but why is it give up their life for some cause beyond themselves? And we mock that they are looking for 72 virgins. Why aren't we looking for 72 virgins? Why is it that that seems so unreal to us? The question of what is the end of life, where we go, obviously has very, very important implications on the practical level. The question of sacred versus secular history. Islam sees its history in a sacred way, that is, its religious history. So did Christianity for a long time, so it still does. But the West does not necessarily look upon it in such a way. The West at the present moment does not only produce best-selling authors who are called themselves brights. They're really very darkened their intellect, but they call themselves brights, like Dawkins and Hitchens and people like that, people who espouse atheism, the most blatant kind. And the Islamic world hasn't caught up with that as yet. And the West also produces from time to time people who try on purpose to destroy Islam's sacred history in the name of freedom and so forth and so on. Now, these are issues whose deep roots have hardly ever been discussed. Even when the Rushdie affair came up, nobody said that it was really the competing views of human freedom versus the rights of sacred history to maintain itself and the right of a people to preserve the sacred history. Closely allied, of course, to this is the issue of rationalism, empiricism versus faith. Christians have faced that over the centuries, and Muslims can learn a great deal from how the Christians have dealt with these issues, going back to after Nicholas of Cusa, who was just mentioned a few moments ago, and the question of the mechanization of the cosmos, the question of the attitude towards modern science and technology. These all issue from what we call values or worldviews and how religion is related to them. An issue that is discussed all the time today, which pits the Islamic world versus the West, and sometimes Christianity, as it identifies itself with the modern West, is the question of human rights versus divine rights. I think if we lived in another period of Western history, Western theologians, philosophers, thinkers would feel themselves very close to the Islamic understanding of human rights as being always related to divine rights. But now divine rights have been murdered in the modern world, more or less. Nobody talks about them anymore. First of all, divine right of kings, of course, disappeared with the destruction of monarchies, and the fact that God has rights over our lives became irrelevant when individualism was taken to its extreme extent, and therefore we have this very, very different view of human rights. And the West oftentimes criticizes the Islamic world for not respecting human rights. If we really analyze this, who is it who would not like to have freedom, who would not have the right to make a living, who would not like to have the right of listening to the kind of music he or she wants to listen to, and so forth and so on down the road? Something much more profound is involved. Why is it that the Muslims aren't emphasizing human rights as much as the English people do or the American people do today? These are issues which deal with worldviews and the relationship between human rights and divine rights. Why is it the Muslims do not want to give up the rights of God upon their life so as to be more free, if I'm going to speak so blatantly? These are issues which, of course, are at the very center of the Islamic Western discussion. Now, we talked on this session, morning session, about religious values. But values. You have two sets of values you have to discuss. First of all, Islamic religious values and Christian religious values. They're very, very close together. Very, very close together. It's hard to find even differences. The value of truth, of justice, of love, of the neighbor, of respect, of responsibility, all the values that we hold dear are shared between Islam and Christianity and also Judaism. It's very, very hard to try to find some basic value which is not included in the other religion. Such is not at all the case of secular values. Some secular values are similar to religious values, but many of them are not. And to equate this question of values between Islam and the West with Islam and the religions of the West is to make a very, very great mistake. When it comes to the question of virtues, this is quite interesting. As far as Islam and Christianity are concerned, virtues are very similar again. No, they're not identical. Certain virtues are emphasized more in Christianity than there are in Islam. But now we have a third partner in this discussion that is a secular person who doesn't believe in God, who doesn't believe in the afterlife, who doesn't believe in the immortality of the soul, but also tries to be virtuous. And oftentimes teaches both Muslims and Christians how to be virtuous. And that has a very deep psychological reason. Namely, a person who negates God wants to be good despite God, and therefore puts double emphasis upon trying to be good, trying to be honest. And you know these issues as well as I do. And this looms very, very strongly in a deeper level, on a deeper level, in the present context of dialogue between Islam and the West. Finally, one of the issues which is very critical when it comes to the question of values and religion is imposing our understanding of the other upon the other. This is based on a value system, imposing our understanding of the other upon the other. With deference to my dear, very old friend, Reisu-l-uleme, Dr. Ceric, I would add that yes, Orientalism did a great deal about Islamic culture, but it tried to impose its understanding of Islamic culture upon that culture. And Edward Seyyed, a brilliant writer whom all of you know, who died recently of cancer, his book Orientalism and many other works written against Orientalism, was not because of the codex by Wensig of the Hadith of the Prophet that he referred to at the present moment, but try not only to understand Islamic culture from the Western point of view, but to impose that upon the Islamic world itself. Something which the Muslims perhaps would like to do, but they can't do it, they don't have the power. But both sides have to consider this idea of having a value within their own worldview as not to want to impose the understanding of the other upon the other. So whatever we say, whatever we do, not only today, but later on in dialogue and all different branches of it, at the heart of it resides how we look upon ourselves in relation to God, in relation to ourselves, in relation to the world. And that, of course, is what religion is concerned with, but so also is the refutation and repudiation of religion in modern ideology. Ideology also tries to substitute its own set of values to deal with these three fundamental relationships. But the relationships cannot be avoided. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that presentation, and to all of our speakers for very insightful presentations. I just thought that apropos to one of the topics that Seyyed Hossein Nasr brought up, I would mention to him that about a week ago I received an incredible hate email. One gets them from time to time, but the author of it, who is a non-Muslim, promised me 72 virgins in hell. So it was a sort of new spin. I had to read it twice to see exactly what was there. In any case, we now have a lot of food for thought, and we have a substantial amount of time for discussion.
I have two questions to more or less all of you, but in particular sort of the Reis and Professor Seyyed Hossein Nasr. The first one is, when we talk about dialogue, obviously dialogue consists of words and language and speaking to each other. Thus, terminology is extremely important if you want to speak to each other in order to speak about the same things. What puzzles me whenever we talk about sort of Islamic Western dialogue, we talk about Islamic and Western. Western being sort of a geographic denomination, which is not even accurate, because when we talk about Islam and West, we even include sort of Japan in Western in that sense. And we have a religious denomination, which is Islamic. The Reis will remember that it's obviously not only Muslims that make that mistake, quote unquote. The West, so-called West, used to differentiate in Bosnia between Serbs, Croats, and Muslims. So two ethnic connotations and one religious. Now in Iraq, we talk about Kurds, Sunni, and Shia, even though the Kurds too are Sunni. So either you talk about Sunni Shia or you talk about Arabs and Kurds. What I'm trying to ask you is, particularly as scholars, is what can we do to actually sort of clarify and create a joint and much more accurate language and terminology, particularly when we talk about our own subject, which is sort of interreligious dialogue? That's the first question. The second one is particularly to you, Professor. I now live in Syria, as I just mentioned, and I have been having this discussion recently, almost daily, on secularity. You also mentioned it a lot in your speech, in your lecture. And in the Arab world, in the Muslim world, secularity seems to have seems to be synonymous with sort of atheist or at least agnostic, unbelieving, which is entirely, at least in my sort of European understanding, incorrect. I'm Austrian, by the way. I'm a European diplomat. You can be profoundly Christian or any other religious and still be sort of profoundly secular at the same time. Being sort of representing the secular concept does not mean that you're a non-believer, at least sort of in our understanding. Sort of this is, again, maybe a question of terminology. In fact, the history of secularity is in order to protect each other, sort of to protect also religious from imperial and other influences. So my question is, where does this come from? What can we do? Again, this is in a way a terminology issue. What can we do to sort of clarify the concept of secularity, or at least to agree on sort of joint terms if we discuss a certain subject? Thank you very much.
Let's take the first question with regard to categorization, and then we'll go to the second.
I'll answer the second question, so I won't answer the first. Let somebody else answer.
Okay.
I'll say this about the terminology. It is highly contested in this work. Nobody is comfortable with these categories of West Islamic. On the other hand, we have not been able to come up with anything that captures the dynamic that we're attempting to report and to survey in our work beside these categories. I think we're open to suggestions, but it is a conversation and really an argument that's been going on for some time.
If I can make a short comment, since you are from Europe and I am too, we Europeans are Eurocentric, and you should read this Spengler book, The Decline of the West, that is warning us not to be too much Eurocentric. So we define things. And Orientalism, or Orient, is where the sun is rising, right? So we defined. So the same thing in the modern history, I think the nation states concept is not Muslim concept. It is Western. So nationalism or the rising of national identities are not of the Muslim product. Within the frame of the Islamic world empire, if you like, what was important for that, let's say, society and the state was not national identity. It was more Islam. In the meantime, in the West, it used to be Christianity and identity, but Enlightenment, I think, brought the Europe and the West in a different direction. So religion became irrelevant. And we are generations as if God does not exist. Secularism is indifferent to that question, but it implies that you can live your life as if God does not exist. But whether he exists, you know, it doesn't too much matter for us. I agree with you. In the last centuries, since Muslims had this civilization, I think, somehow the puzzle is how this civilization came down almost to the margin of history. What Muslims are trying to do these last 2 centuries is come back to the mainstream of history, and they are coming in the name of Islam. So Muslims are emphasizing their identity, Islamic identity, more than necessary, and in the West, somehow, they are recognizing Muslims as such. I think this is wrong. We have a confusion, and this confusion, I cannot give you any big hope whether we are going to clarify that or not very soon. And we are going to live with this confusion for a long time. But I think basically we know what we are talking about. The Muslim world being in the way it is, and the Western civilization and the Western world in the way it is.
I'll be very brief because I'm sure other people want to ask questions. It depends, of course, again, the question of terminology, how you define secularism. Secularism, what comes from the Latin word secular, but it's always juxtaposed to the sacred. Now, if you do not like the word secularism, you can use desacralization. That is what happened in a certain part of the world, and not the whole of even Europe. In Western Europe was a gradual process of desacralization, which is usually called secularism, in which the question of God is a matter of indifference, as he just said, that you can live with God, you can live without God. And in certain countries, such as India, in order for the Hindus and the Muslims to live together, the Congress Party and these people will always talk about secularism. It's not only in Europe, whereas the BJP and others are against secularism and therefore Hindu dominance over Muslims. And things like that have also occurred in Europe. After the French Revolution, many people who were strongly anti-Catholic thought that their duty was to defend all religions, but that was also to weaken Christianity. But the issues are much deeper than that. Namely, Islam, even in its weakened form today in certain places, cannot accept that the hands of God have been cut off from his creation, or that God is simply a hypothesis you can follow or not follow. It's a reality for them. And that is juxtaposed to a large number of people who are not against somebody else going to church, but who don't want to go to church themselves. I mean, like in France, I have many French friends who are not against some other Frenchman being a Catholic and going to Saint-Sulpice on Sunday mornings or Notre Dame, but who don't want to go themselves. They don't believe in the Trinity, they don't believe in unity, and they call themselves secularists. So it's really a question of definition. The way I use the term secularism, and many people like me, is a kind of clear philosophical definition, is to take the sacred out of things. That's what means secular. So you have two worldviews, one in which everything is imbued with the presence of the sacred. In Islam, there's not even a word for secularism. Arabic, Persian, Turkish have no word for secularism. They use European words or almaniya and things like that, which are all modern contrived words in Arabic. There's no classical word for it, and same in my own language, Persian. But so people who believe that there's in fact not a breach in the nature of reality, with God being somewhere out there and the rest being, the world being out of his hand, and those who believe that it is possible to live in such a way. So this represents a great challenge. As I repeat again, it did for Christians and Jews for a long, long time in the West, as this movement began to spread. And today, still some people are very uncomfortable about it. I think the present Pope is trying to restate certain ideas of the resacralization of knowledge in the West, which makes it very difficult for many other people to swallow.
Would anyone else like to raise a question or make a comment? Yes, all the way in the back.
Morning, sir. My name is Raja. I'm a student in the Master of Science for Foreign Service program. I come from India, so since you had brought up the topic of secularism as practiced in India, I felt there's a comment that I wanted to make here, that as opposed to secularism as practiced, for example, in parts of Europe, such as France, where the state believes that there should be absolute equality between religions, or that there should be no bias towards any religion, or that there should be no exhibition of a religious kind. Secularism as practiced in the East, and when I mean East, I mean a bit of Turkey as well. I'm not too sure of that, but definitely what I've seen in India is where the state allows, or rather encourages actually, every religion to actually propagate and to be exhibitive. The state also patronizes each and every religion to the extent of, say, funding, giving funds, for example, to religious schools or education institutions set up by these religious communities. So I think there is a distinction here that what should be the role of state? Should the role of state be such as to negate any support to a religion, or should the role of state be such that they patronize and encourage all religions equally in an attempt to build a more pluralistic community?
If you allow me just to follow your comment, we have to distinguish secularism from metaphysical secularism and political secularism.
That's right.
Metaphysical secularism is not acceptable to any religion, meaning that each religion, including Islam and Christianity, Judaism, they are affirming the idea of God, and there is no doubt about it. This metaphysical secularism is not acceptable to any religion, as far as I know. Political secularism is acceptable even to Islam, meaning the distribution of the responsibility in the society. But the worst service to secularism was done by the state of secularism of this former Soviet Union, because they destroyed the idea of secularism using the force like you have in the name of religion. You have, if the state comes and imposes metaphysical worldview, whether it is secular or not, then it is a self-destructive idea. And the same thing with religion. So I think the Muslims can accept the idea of political secularism in which the state is the institution that should serve all the citizens equally, which means to distribute the justice.
The one Islamic state which tried to do this is Turkey, which in fact didn't do that at all. In Turkish, you use the word laïcisation from French into Turkish, and there the secularism means precisely to prevent religion from manifesting itself in the public domain. There's no society in the Islamic world, in the whole of history, in which religion was suppressed as much as after Kemal Atatürk came to power. And now 80 years later, you see what's going on in Turkey at the present moment. So Indian secularism is not the same thing as Turkish secularism. That's a very, very different phenomenon.
Would any of our other panelists like to weigh in on that? Okay. Yes.
My name's Adnan Hassan. I'm a senior advisor at the World Bank. I'm here in my personal capacity. One observation and a question. I actually was listening to NPR after the election in Turkey, and it was quite amusing that the moderator said in setting the piece up that, as the audience may have heard, in Turkey, a Muslim was elected prime minister. And I thought that was extremely interesting and picked up on the point that we've been making, that the definition of secular and religious is such that the assumption was that none of the other prime ministers in Turkey were Muslim. And that's what with NPR. So well, let's just say that in the common parlance, it must be a real issue. My question, although I'm here in my personal capacity, I do have a question which relates to the work I do in the bank and the work that we do around the world. As you know, the World Bank, we do about 227 projects a year around the world, lend about $12 billion a year. We've got a major influence across the globe in terms of, in the area of what's called development. And I'm curious if you've got thoughts on Islam's view on development, Islam's view on, obviously spirituality is there, but the material aspects. I mean, the Prophet at the end of the day was a merchant, a trader. In some ways, I mean, if I remember correctly, his wife was his venture capitalist. She provided the seed funding for his business. So any thought that you may have on the role that Islam in particular has with respect to development and to capitalism? You're seeing that growth of Islamic finance, which is exceeding the growth rates of conventional finance in many Muslim countries. And I just wonder if you've got any thoughts on the integration issues or the contradiction issues between Islam and faith, development, capitalism, that issue.
You want to say something, Dr. Ceric?
Yeah, very short. First of all, on the issue of secularism, I'll just give you something. My recent experience, there was one gentleman that asked me, do you have in Bosnia secularists? I said, yes, we do have some of them. And I said, ask him why. He said, I would like to see him. So I asked him, what is secularist? He said, I am secularist. I said, how? Because I don't go to church, he said to me. Then I said to him, we are together. I don't go to church either. so I am secularist too. You see, I think we have simplification of things that are very serious. And as to the development in Islam's view in development, I would like to ask you what kind of development you mean. Yeah. If you mean the human development or, producing children, and Muslims are the best in that. So it depends what you mean by development, I think. And I think you should learn from us, from the West should learn from Muslims how to develop the humankind, especially in Europe. And as to other development, I think technology and other things, I think Muslims are a little bit lazy in that. And I wish it has nothing to do with Islam. It has to do with their, buying, because they have some money. They can buy everything what the West is producing. So for the time being, they have no motivation to probably develop in this, let's say, technological. But Islam is worldly religion. Islam it teaches Muslims to live and to enjoy this life. Of course, not too much, because they have to go in the hereafter anyway.
Do you want me to say something about this? With the wonderful sense of humor that Ceric has, he answered your question, but there are deeper issues, of course, involved. The question asks, what is the attitude of Islam towards development? You would ask, what is the attitude of Christianity, Judaism towards development? Development, as you're using it, itself developed from the 18th century onward with the idea of progress that came to the fore after the 18th and 19th century, especially in the 19th century. Of course, these philosophical transformations were alien to the Islamic world. And today we have a great deal of problem dealing with the meaning of development, the idea of the underdeveloped countries. Now that we have the environmental crisis, the problem of the world is not underdevelopment, but overdevelopment. We have to stop overdeveloped countries. We have to redefine what development really means. And Islam as a religion, of course, our teachings about the social sphere, the economic sphere, human life, and so forth, but the philosophical idea of development, which underlies the World Bank, grew out of a particular experience of Western Europe and America in the 19th century. And Islam does not have a kind of theology of development, no more than does Christianity. I've read some works by Christian theologians try to discuss development. But for a religion, development is really development of the human being. Like the word progress in English, which originally was pilgrim's progress. That is, your progress spiritually towards God. And then the idea itself was desacralized, secularized. So we now, in the 19th century, we had the Malthusian ideas and Darwinian ideas of progress, and Herbert Spencer, who philosophizes. Islam has not had too much thought given in a theological sense to answer your question. It's been mostly on the political level, and Muslims who've discussed this question of development in the context of their own societies.
Jane?
I'd like to say a word on this from a slightly different angle, and that is to refer to the extraordinary number of efforts, even within the United States, that would rank as development efforts that have in fact been embarked upon as interfaith initiatives. And I'll point specifically to the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. There were religious communities from around the country, Muslims, Christians, Jews, who collaborated to get relief to the people in New Orleans and who have continued to do sustained development work in those communities. I know in particular we had the head of an organization in Houston who was here and was speaking about the kind of interfaith development work that they had been able to do immediately after that tragedy, because as religious communities, as interfaith communities in Houston, they had already collaborated on a lot of local efforts and initiatives for the betterment of their own, of the social fabric of that city, and therefore were able to immediately transport that to humanitarian relief in New Orleans.
Yes. Right up here.
I wondered if I might just
identify yourself.
Alistair MacDonald Radcliffe of the World Economic Forum and the Anglican Church, an unusual combination.
Would you like
perhaps.
to say that you're speaking simply for yourself and
I'm
not the...
speaking for myself, of course. I just wanted to probe a little the Nasrian critique, if we might put it that way, of secularism and the implication that values might not be as common among us as we might suppose. There has been a lot of celebration of common values. There's clearly a lot of political mileage to be gained, I think quite rightly, in celebrating those commonalities. And yet there is clearly a sense also in which we feel that there is a challenge posed from secularism which embraces those. So I'm just wanting to probe that a little bit. How do we approach those commonalities and celebrate them in a useful way that can embrace the secular, and yet at the same time recognize the force of the insights from a religious perspective, which see virtue as truly attainable only within the religious context? And perhaps then ask that question about secularism. Is it something then that certain religious communities would see as a vehicle for, in fact, projecting a liberal universalism that is, in fact, quite separate from being pluralist? So is there some tension between pluralism and some kind of monist universalism coming under a secular guise? And come back to my first question, are our values truly common? Are they not? How do we address that? And how do we grapple with the need to express our commonalities in the political arena?
Well, I concur completely with what he says. I don't think I need to make a comment. There's a very subtle and important point you alluded to, namely what you call universalist monism. This term perhaps I would not use, but there is a very big difference between religious pluralism, in which you preserve your identity as a particular religious community and faith, and at the same time have accord with and harmony with the other, and the kind of least common denominator reduction of our religions to a kind of global I always say jokingly, United Nations, religion for all nations. I have respect for the United Nations. I don't want to disparage it, but a kind of global, what you call monism. There's a very big difference. And that is one of the differences in the value system that I alluded to between the religions, whose values are based upon a particular revelation, a particular sacred text, and those who believe this is innate to the human being and you don't need religion to have these values and therefore it's universal, but in the sense that you are criticizing. I agree with you completely.
Lamin, Sanneh?
Yes, I think one of the most important challenges we face in America, particularly in Western culture in general, but in America in particular, is the tension between diversity and difference. And many of my students, for example, who are very serious about what they're about, wonder whether commitment is compatible with tolerance. Can you be committed? Can you be a believer, for example, and be accepting of others? And I like to flip that in a sense. I like to say that whatever you believe in, if you believe in diversity, you're committed to that. But what is the meaning of diversity if it rejects, repudiates difference? What are you being diverse about? And so it seems to me that this is a recurrent issue we cannot really resolve until we confront one of the things I take from the work of Seyyed Hossein Nasr, is this sort of fundamental commitment. It doesn't really matter what it is. Life is too precious. You don't get out of bed for nothing. If it didn't mean anything, why would you get out of bed? You get out of bed, wash your face, and get on with life. So there are things that you say, well, life is precious, and so if I believe in something, I will commend it. The challenge, however, is an environment of commonality, having common values, which for many of my students means, they think it means, you cannot therefore be committed to anything particular or anything specific. And that is the huge issue in our culture generally, that diversity trumps difference, that you cannot be different in our, I see it among my students, they say, we're all the same, which is a way of shutting people's mouths so that they cannot be different. We're all the same. We are afraid of difference. And that's what I alluded to in the beginning, to say we don't really train our students to have a conversation across frontiers, across borders. I would argue that actually difference commitment make diversity and tolerance meaningful. It's something that John Locke alluded to in his essay on toleration, by the way, that toleration itself, tolerance, is a religious value.
I think this is the very important question when we talk about how Muslims perceive themselves and how the West is looking at the Muslim possible change or adopting certain common values that we all share. Now, when we talk about common values, we talk about religious background, but we are forgetting that we have two generations that are raised almost of non-religious feeling, especially in the West. But if I may, Professor Esposito, use this opportunity to say, as I see it, it's very important. The Muslims today have internal debate that is, I think, not seen for a long time. And I am very glad that we have. Unfortunately, some of this debate is violent. But this is inevitable for the Muslims to go through. But my understanding is this. The Muslim history has one miracle and one puzzle. The miracle is that Islam was spread in 7th century from the Bedouin perspective, who did not have army, no civilization, no experience, through two great civilizations at the time, Byzantine and Persian, as you know. These Muslims, the Arabs, they adopted these two civilizations and developed another, their civilization called Islamic civilization, whatever. And you know that in the Middle Ages, And the West was very much jealous or envious of what was happening in the East. Now we have a puzzle. In 18th century, this great civilization came down to the margin of history. And Muslims lost everything, political, geographical, economic, and even cultural, and even their own faith. Last 2 centuries, Muslims are trying to come back to mainstream history of the world. There were so many movements, but I would emphasize 2 movements that are very parallel. The secularization of the Muslim mind and history based on the Western model. That you have Turkey, Tunisia, and others. And then you have a re-Islamization of the Muslim world, meaning Abu Ala al-Ma'arri, Abu Ala al-Mawdudi, he was teacher for Seyyed Qutb, by the way, and then Ikhwan al-Muslimin, and then finally revolution in Iran. Now, if you follow the history, these 2 last centuries, you will see that this secularism was, according to the Muslim understanding, imposed by the West. These are the modernists and so on. But why I believe that the secularism in Muslim world failed because Muslim secularists did not bring social justice to the Muslim world. And because of their failure, the West failed. Or because West failed, they failed, whatever. And finally, and now we at the moment, I believe, that secularism in the Muslim world failed. And it cannot come back. You know, the Habib Bourguiba used to say to Ataturk, why didn't you pronounce Islamic State and impose secularism? What he used to do. He proclaimed Islamic State, but was implementing secularism, isn't it? So this is the debate among the Muslim politicians. But after the Iranian Revolution, that was successful in terms of this concept of re-Islamization, the whole Muslim world was put in a different set of values and directions. So what we have now, you better understand, the Muslims today are in the process of re-Islamization. There is no way going back to secularization. You in the West, and we in the West, I will be with you now, we have to understand that. The question is now, which way this re-Islamization of the Muslims is going to be? Is it going to be isolation or cooperation and integration in the world affairs? I plead to the West to help the Muslims to go to the way of integration and the way of cooperation in the global affairs, including what is happening today in the Middle East. I think this is the way for going forward, not only for the Muslim world, but for the West as well. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Yes. Yeah.
I'm Avis Asier Allman. I'm a, independent scholar, and I was associated with the center a while ago, about 10 years ago. You made a statement just now that this Muslim secularists looking to the West as a model are failing. And my expertise is Turkey, and I have studied as a scholar what's going on there. I think the recent election and the presidency of Abdullah Gül, and as Abdullah as a world leader, is a really important phenomenon. I think that movement is quite strong in the world. I agree with you, the re-Islamization is also a strong movement, but I wouldn't say, if you look at Turkey as a model, that it is dying or not strong, okay? I think both exist. And so I guess I just wanted to present a different point of view from what you were saying, sir.
If I may say, I fully agree with you, and I support what is going on in Turkey. And I think that Turkey is a good model of my argument, because Turkey is a secular state, not the society. There is a difference. The Turkey is a secular state, which means that for the Turkish state is not the source, religion is not the source of legislation, of judicial system or whatever. But the society of Turkey is more Muslim today. I just visited Istanbul and mosques are full, if you like. And I was in Ramadan, by the way. And the Muslim Turks, or Turkish Muslims, are very much religious in that sense. So yes, political secularism, yes, it is very healthy for the Muslims. By the way, one of the Muslims who believed in the union of the religion and state, I don't want to mention his name, but he's very revolutionary anyway. He visited us in Bosnia for a week. And then he visited our institutions, Islamic, and we are secular in Bosnia, and we are separated from the state. I am Grand Mufti elected by the Muslims, not appointed by the king or by the government, and so on and so on. And when he finished his visit, I asked him, by the way, Professor John Esposito, he visited also, and he also saw our institutions, how they work. And he said, you know, after visit Bosnia, I have to re-examine my views regarding the organization of the state in the Muslim world. I said, why? He said, I think that secularism is a good idea. I said, why? Because I saw in you that you are independent and you are working very good because government is not interfering in your work. But in the case of Turkey, I am not sure that the religious institutions are separated from the state. On the contrary, I think this Turkish secularism is controlling the religious institution for this exactly in order to succeed in their secularization in the area which the Turkish state doesn't have the right. I think that the Turkish state should be secular state in the sense allowing religious institutions to develop like you have, for example, in the West. But this is debate. Anyway, thank you for Turkey. I think Turkey is a good example, and I wish that the Turkey will remain a good model for the other Muslim countries to be followed.
We have time for one more question. Sorry, but...
I'm Werner Hein. I'm an attorney, and I'm here in a private capacity. A year ago, Pope Benedict XVI gave his speech in Regensburg and certainly triggered a very serious debate. Two questions. One is pitting faith against reason, or let's say dealing with this issue. Is this an issue which is a pivotal issue in the dialogue between the Christians and Muslims? And second, I would be interested in how the Muslim community views this speech now 1 year after it had been done.
Okay, Seyyed.
Since I've been at the forefront of all of this discussion, the response of the Islamic world to the lecture of the Pope, to the address, I say a few words about it. First of all, I was absolutely astounded. As a person who knows a little bit about philosophy, both Islamic and Western, the assertions that were made, the introduction of the use of reason in the definition of faith and in the definition of Christian theology came into Europe in the 13th century by St. Thomas. And the church first was totally opposed to the teachings of Averroes. And with the synthesis of St. Thomas that allowed, in fact, the Catholicism to flower in the 13th century. So in a sense, the use of reason in matters of religion came to the West through the Islamic world, firstly. Secondly, Islam, it's mainstream. You always have schools, fidei schools in all religions. The mainstream of Islamic thought has always emphasized the use of reason in the defense of faith, like the credo of Tahawi, others, the famous credos in the Sunni and the Shiite world, is even to provide as many arguments for the existence of God as you can muster, as you can do. And for centuries upon end, when there were polemics written by Christians against Islam, it was that these were just rationalists who didn't understand the mysteries of the faith. So this statement is really astounding. I don't know who told His Holiness these things to say, but whoever it was either had ideological axe to grind or didn't really know much about not only Islamic theology, but even Western Christian theology. And now the response in the Islamic world was, of course, one of anger and disbelief. But they did not become violent except one or two places where excuses were made. But the mainstream countries like Egypt or Iran or places, major Islamic countries, Indonesia, there was no violence in the street against Catholics. I said there were 2 or 3 instances in which this was made an excuse. I think it was Somalia, someplace somebody got killed, which was very unfortunate. The response really came in the form of a letter signed by 38 Muslim thinkers and theologians, including yours truly, who was by mistake put in the list. And we prepared this letter and sent it to the Vatican with the hope of starting a profound dialogue with Christianity. Not only diplomacy, that the ministers of foreign affairs should do, but profound dialogue about basic religious theological issues. Unfortunately, we have not received any positive response yet from the Vatican. That's how things stand.
Mr. Chairman, allow me to say, because this is a very interesting issue. I'm coming from Europe, and we in Europe know several things for sure. And one is that the Pope is infallible, you know, for the Catholics. And since I live in Europe, I have to accept for the sake of dialogue, that to accept the assumption of the Catholics who believe that the Pope is infallible. So I don't think that this is appropriate for us to say anything about the Pope. Let the Catholics talk about what they think about it. But we as Muslims, of course, we have to say something about it. And that is, recently I was at the Leiden University in Holland, where they brought a picture from a church, where you see all the bishops. On the top is Thomas Aquinas, and under his feet was the picture of Ibn Rushd or Averroes. That was the first time that we saw this picture. And the symposium was about religious and academic freedom. And professor who brought the picture, he said, I just want you to see that we in Europe are changing our attitudes toward Muslims. And he then, as a gesture of dialogue, he took the picture of Ibn Rushd to be a symbol of that symposium. And I came, as I talked on that occasion, talking about training imams in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and I said, I see that you are changing your opinions, despite sometimes even the Pope's attitudes toward reason. And I am grandson of that gentleman, so I'm very proud of that. And they asked me whether they can put this statement as a motto for the book, so they will do that. What I'm trying to say, and you in the West, or we in the West must understand, that the Muslims taught Europe rationalism, not the other way around. You know how? Because Ibn Rushd was in Cordoba explaining Aristotle, where Dante Alighieri was writing his Divine Comedy and putting Averroes into the 8th of his Inferno for spreading rationalism in Europe. But Ibn Rushd, of course, he was not very much favored by Muslims. You know that he was expelled even from and somewhere, but he was a Muslim. And he, together with others, did teach the West or Europe about rationalism. My answer to the Pope is that, and to the Catholics and to the cardinals who will elect Pope in the future, it's not always good to elect too much intellectual Pope. It is better to elect the Pope that would not be too much intellectual, to go over the issues that are for dialogue, as we had the Pope John II, Paul John II, whom I met 4 times, and I think that we will wait for a long time to see the Pope that Muslims appreciated so much that I was afraid that many of them will go after him rather than not. So I think we learn something very, very important in this incident, that after all, I think I appreciate and respect the belief of the Catholics that Pope is infallible. And we in Europe, we need strong Pope that will not talk about issues that will not get us together, because we need strong Pope so that unite us and get how to see dialogue in the West and in the East. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that, yes, Jane,
I think
go
just
ahead.
a very brief response. A couple of things. I certainly don't want to be placed in the position of defending the statement at Regensburg, but I would like to contextualize it in two ways, building upon the very insightful remarks of both of my colleagues. Certainly, the relations of faith and reason are a long and complex tradition in both Christianity and Islam. They predate the Middle Ages, but dialectical syllogistic reasoning was given a particular impetus, and a very important one, for the systematization of theology in the time of Aquinas and after, and there are deep Islamic roots for that. But the contextualization of that statement, it was a very unfortunate statement. I think those of us who have been involved in Muslim-Catholic relations, as I have been for decades, felt our hearts sink at that moment. And I remember meeting with Professor Nasr very soon after that was released with a group that John had convened, and there was a great deal of sorrow in that room. But we also, I think, have to recognize the long history within the Roman Catholic Church, particularly since the 1960s, of taking genuine leadership, world leadership in the area of Muslim-Christian relations. It is precisely John Paul II that did so much to move this forward at international, national, and regional levels. And I would like to make sure that that larger context is not lost through one particularly divisive and unfortunate speech.
Great. Thank you very much. As we bring this to a close so that we can end on time, I'd like to hope that no member of the media will have a headline saying that the Grand Mufti of Bosnia has suggested that when it comes to Grand Muftis, chief rabbis, and popes, one should not elect anyone who's an intellectual. I would like to thank all of our speakers for the wisdom that they brought today. I'd like to thank our audience for its questions and its comments. And I'd like to point out that the next session is at 2:30, and it will be on education and development, chaired by Professor Catherine Marshall, who has had 2 hats in recent years, both at the World Bank and now at Georgetown. Thank you all for coming.